And in my article, I set out the details of the violent episodes that occurred when the separatists became violent in an attempt to force separatism on the People's Republic of China. That is how these events occurred. The way they're reported in the West is fundamentally different. The West reports it as genocide, as an attempt by the China state to remove large numbers of Uyghurs and to reduce their population significantly. That, by any definition, is genocide. Whether it's deaths, whether it's forced sterilization, it is reducing the number of people, hoping to eliminate their culture, their way of life, and their numbers. That is how the West has reported the problems of separatism in China. Now, the West has intentionally misrepresented, in my view, what is going on in Xinjiang.
Why do you think? Yeah, why do you think it is missing, and why do you think the West, either the politicians or journalism or publications, have intentionally missed out that bit of the information?
It's my view, Xin, that there is an overarching geopolitical explanation for the question that you ask. The West is frightened, intimidated, worried by the remorseless rise of China to become the #1 economic power. History tells us throughout the centuries that there is always conflict between a rising power and an established power. The Americans know this themselves. They refer to it as the Thucydides principle, which refers to Greek history. I won't go into that in detail, but the principle is there in history. Yeah. And you have a situation today where America has been the top international power for many years, certainly since 1945, probably earlier as well. And now, remorselessly, relentlessly, the big experiment in China, which the Americans disregarded for many years, has become increasingly successful, and China is poised to become the top economic power. Just bear in mind, this is a very difficult thing for the Americans to accept. That's why I say the issue of Xinjiang exists on its own, but it exists within the overarching geopolitical struggles between the rising economic power and the established economic power.
Let me ask you this. How do you look at the measures that China or Xinjiang has been taking in order to handle terrorism or to prevent terrorism? What does amount to in your eyes, and how far away, how detached is the Western narrative of so-called concentration camp in your eyes with reality?
Well, let me tell you what I think the Chinese did, and then let me comment on how the West reports what the Chinese did, because they're two different things. First of all, I think the Chinese divided the people of Xinjiang into three groups, the Uyghurs into three groups, not Xinjiang, the Uyghurs. They divided them. There was the hardcore terrorists. That was the hardcore group of people, the leaders, the people that resorted to violence, the people that came to Beijing and stabbed ordinary pedestrians, that responsible for the Kunming railway explosion and other events. That's a small group of people. Behind them is a larger group of people, of followers, people who are influenced by the terrorists, but who aren't necessarily the terrorists. That's the second group. And then there's a third group, which is very important, which is the overwhelming majority of Uyghurs who live in Xinjiang and live in a happy, contented state. So as regards the first group, the terrorists, the Chinese action was resolute and firm. There were arrests, there were deaths, and I'm sure there were executions. But for the group in the middle, the large number of people who were influenced by terrorist thinking, the Chinese came up with the idea of re-education camps. This is something that the West calls concentration camps. And it is that over which there is much difference.
How do you look at these measures? Because for some people, even taking measures to prevent terrorism in their eyes is not acceptable. And however China tries to explain or tries to show some people, they seem to think that you know, these measures to prevent, to preempt any terrorism crimes is not acceptable. What is your understanding and your argument here?
Well, every government regards itself as entitled to take action against people who are trying to overthrow the government. I think China took a very significant difference of opinion, not opinion, difference of action between the hardcore terrorists who they regarded as enemies and which any government would have regarded as enemies because they resorted to violence, and the larger number of followers who the Chinese wanted to wean away, take away from the ideology of violence and separatism. At first, the Chinese tried the time-honored method of arrest and prison. But they found, as the West has found, that if you put followers into prison with the extremists turn the followers into extremists. So the Chinese realized, I think, that they had to take decisive action to separate the hardcore terrorists from the followers, and it is the followers who they have compelled to engage in a re-education process. The West calls it brainwashing. The West calls it concentration camps. That's because the West wants to misrepresent what China is doing. But the reality is that China's been quite far-sighted in trying to save future deaths by educating many of the people who had sympathy with the separatists and winning them away from that destructive ideology.